A mysterious virus intoxicates the crew and threatens the Enterprise in Star Trek the original series' first season, 4th episode, The Naked Time. But what happened? What did I like? And what didn't I like so much? Before I get into this recap and review, please note this video contains spoilers, so if you've not yet seen this episode, this might not be the video for you. Let's warp into this. The Enterprise arrives in orbit of the frozen planet Psi-2000 on a mission to observe its imminent disintegration. Spock and Lieutenant Tormolen beam down to a laboratory on the planet's surface, but arrive to discover a frozen facility and the bodies of the lab's scientists, the cause of their deaths ranging from violent murder to seemingly bizarre mishap. Whilst investigating, Tormolen removes one of his environmental suit gloves, unknowingly exposing himself to a strange liquid on a frozen wall that is drawn to his hand. Spock contacts the Enterprise and informs Kirk of the situation. Kirk asks what caused the death of the scientists, to which Spock replies, "Unknown, Captain. It's like nothing we've dealt with before." What a great opening sequence this was. Short, snappy, filled with intrigue, and clearly setting us up for the madness to come. A cold open that would become the blueprint not only for this show, but the franchise as a whole. I particularly love the introduction to the lab, with director Mark Daniels utilising a wide shot that pans in on the frozen figure, perfectly accompanied by Alexander Courage's score, which results in the scene successfully establishing a mysterious and otherworldly vibe, but also feeling epic despite the episode's bottle show nature. Considerably less epic, however, were the environmental suits, which very much look like the shower curtains they were made out of. And what can we say about Tormolen's moment of madness? It's a silly moment for sure, taking your gloves off in a clearly dangerous environment, but this wasn't the first time we'd see people do questionable things in space, and it definitely wouldn't be the last. Spock and Tormolen return to the Enterprise and are decontaminated upon arrival before heading to sickbay for further examination. The two pass Dr. McCoy's testing, but Tormolen appears upset by what he saw, questioning his and humanity's presence in space. Kirk, unfazed by the lieutenant's sudden change in behaviour, orders him to get some rest. The senior crew meet to discuss the landing party's findings, as well as the planet's current status. Kirk asks if what happened on the surface could repeat on the Enterprise. Spock is uncertain as their scanners are limited and space still contains many unknowns. Scotty, however, is confident that they'll be safe from the planet's destruction as long as the crew stay sane and the engines remain online. In the recreation room, Lieutenants Sulu and Riley join Tormolen, who appears sweaty and anxious. Sulu attempts to convince Riley to take up fencing before turning his attention to Tormolen, who quickly turns hostile, pointing a knife at the pair and repeating his fears of space exploration before turning the knife on himself. Sulu and Riley attempt to wrestle the knife away, but are unsuccessful as Tormolen stabs himself in the struggle. Riley calls a medical emergency, but notices that he too is beginning to sweat. For all the episode's famous hijinks and visuals, it might be hard to remember that there are actually some pretty decent concepts here. Spock's tearful maternal regrets and Kirk's lonely confessions are aspects that would help define these iconic characters. Spock's meltdown in particular would unexpectedly turn him into one of the biggest sex symbols of the 60s, for reasons that are still a little unclear to me. But it's actually Tormolen's existential cosmic dread that, for me anyway, is by far the most interesting of these heavier concepts, one that I wish had been expanded on further. This notion that space probably isn't the best place to be is something we'd see repeatedly in future Trek thanks to the sacrifice of countless red shirts, as well as this zinger of a line from Kelvin McCoy.
Space is disease and danger wrapped in darkness and silence.
While the concepts were strong, the execution of the episode left a lot to be desired in places, with the recreation room scene a notable example. Establishing shots of the crew were odd, particularly when you don't see anyone step in to help prevent a legitimate suicide attempt, and feels like a microcosm of the poor handling of extras to communicate the real scale of the crisis unfolding on the ship. Now at their stations on the bridge, Sulu and Riley begin to show signs of infection and are slow and careless with their duties as the planet's disintegration begins to accelerate. In sickbay, McCoy and Nurse Chapel attempt to save Tormolen, but fail despite their best efforts. Reporting the loss to Kirk, a confused McCoy tells the captain the injury wasn't severe, concluding that the crewman had simply lost the will to live. Back on the bridge, Sulu and Riley's condition worsens. Sulu abandons his post to go exercise, while Riley begins exaggerating his Irish ancestry, which soon draws the attention of Spock, who orders the lieutenant to sickbay. Elsewhere, Sulu leaps around the ship, frightening the crew with his fencing rapier. Sulu then heads to the bridge and attempts to abduct Uhura, but is quickly subdued by Kirk and Spock. Meanwhile, Psi-2000's disintegration intensifies, destabilizing the Enterprise's orbit. With the helm unresponsive, Kirk calls to engineering, but to his surprise, the call is answered by Riley, who has locked Scotty and crew out of engineering and taken control of the ship. Broadcasting ship-wide, Riley proclaims himself captain, orders ice cream for the crew, and attempts to de-stress the situation with a bad rendition of an old Irish ballad. Kirk and crew are unable to turn off Riley's broadcast, but that's the least of their concerns, with the now powerless Enterprise only 20 minutes from destruction. It's around this point that things begin to fall apart, not just for the crew, but the episode as a whole. Now don't get me wrong, there's fun to be had watching a bare-chested Sulu do his best Musketeers impression, and Kirk's understandable pain at Riley's endless renditions of
"I'll take you home again, Kathleen."
never fails to amuse, but this doesn't fully excuse the episode's many contrivances. My main gripe lies with Spock, who is completely oblivious to Sulu and Riley's plotting of extracurricular activities mere feet away, as well as the inconsistency surrounding the transmission of the virus. It's made quite clear with sounds earlier in the episode that this virus spreads via sweat, so why aren't Uhura, Spock, and Kirk infected when they encounter and neutralize Sulu on the bridge? The answer to this, ultimately, is that the episode just needed it to be this way, and that's a lazy cop-out. Spock heads to engineering, where Scotty is attempting to cut through the door. On his way, Spock observes several infected crew acting impulsively before heading to sickbay, where Chapel, infected by Riley earlier, confesses her love for him. Chapel infects Spock, who quickly feels the effects of the virus, insisting that he is still in control of his emotions. Despite his Vulcan discipline, Spock struggles to maintain composure as he wanders through the ship, eventually isolating himself in the briefing room. Spock attempts several mental exercises, but despite his efforts, soon loses control of his emotions and breaks down in tears. Kirk arrives at engineering, where Scotty finally breaks through the door. The two surprise and capture Riley, who is taken away by security. Now back in control of his ship, Kirk orders the Enterprise to depart the planet's orbit, but Scotty discovers the ship's engines have been completely shut down and require at least 30 minutes to restart. Kirk reminds Scotty that they only have 8 minutes, to which the chief engineer replies that he can't change the laws of physics. My biggest problem with The Naked Time isn't actually anything with the episode itself, but rather its placement in the series. The episode serves to take its characters and have them act against type, which is something we've seen countless shows, Trek and beyond, do to great effect. But from a first airing perspective, this is just the 4th episode of the show, already airing following a jarring detour to a hard-to-reconcile second pilot. Simply and bluntly put, we don't know these characters well enough at this point for this kind of storytelling. Now, this is probably going to be a contentious point. After all, Gene Roddenberry himself defended the decision, reasoning the episode would help us understand the motivations and desires of the characters. I get where he's coming from, but I feel this understanding would have happened naturally over time anyway, and that this episode would have been far better saved for later in the season. Scotty tells Kirk a cold restart is possible with a controlled matter-antimatter implosion, but he needs Spock's calculations to ensure it works. In sickbay, McCoy successfully identifies the virus and develops a cure which is quickly administered to Sulu. Kirk finds Spock in the briefing room, who tearfully confesses his regret over not being able to tell his mother that he loves her. Kirk attempts to snap Spock out of it, slapping his first officer, who responds by hitting the captain, infecting him and sending him backwards over the briefing room table. Now also showing signs of the virus, Kirk admits being lonely, having chosen the captain's life over a relationship. Kirk also confesses to having feelings for Yeoman Rand. The captain's revelation somehow restores Spock's control, who works with Scotty to restart the engines. Still emotional, Kirk heads towards the bridge, quietly promising his ship that he'll never lose her, ever. Kirk arrives on the bridge, greeted by McCoy, who administers the cure to the captain. Kirk resumes command with a now cured Sulu, plotting a course to escape from orbit. Kirk reaches out for Rand, but remembers his duty and resists. The engines restart and the Enterprise escapes the planet right as it disintegrates, but the implosion unexpectedly throws them back in time by 3 days. Having discovered a method of time travel, and with some extra time now on their hands, Kirk orders the Enterprise on a new course at Warp 1. time. Rather appropriately, the episode's crescendo is a bit mental. Kirk and Spock's confrontation in the briefing room gives us those welcome heady concept moments, but also comes with a noticeably homoerotic undertone that probably formed the genesis of all that steamy fanfiction the two were famously responsible for. McCoy ripping Kirk's shirt open before the crew save themselves at the very last second and nonchalantly discovering time travel in the process was a sequence so bonkers I remain unsure what to make of it all. It's simultaneously cheesy sci-fi gold and Star Trek at its worst. I can totally see why you might love The Naked Time. It's an episode that takes risks, putting our heroes in a real crisis and mining powerful drama and character insight at the same time. It's also a great example of how absurd this show could get, with mileage varying wildly depending on your preference for that brand of Star Trek. For me though, this episode is a real mixed bag. I like the concept and some of its technical execution, but overall it feels rushed, inconsistent, annoyingly low scale, and inorganic, with an ending that feels more like a studio mandate rather than a logical conclusion. It did give us swashbuckling Sulu though, and that alone might just be worth giving this a watch. I'm giving The Naked Time 2 stars out of 5. But what did you think of this episode? Did you love it? Did you hate it? How would you rate it? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Star Trek videos like this coming soon. Until next time, I'm the Trek Lad. Live long and prosper.